Thank you, Isis and the Homestead Museum for hosting me today. And I certainly want to thank all of you who are joining us on the eve of the 151st anniversary of the Chinese Massacre. Whenever I talk about this massacre and the early Chinese in Los Angeles, I always like to acknowledge those people who pointed me in the right direction when I started my research in 2005. First are Eugene Moy and Sue Ellen Chang, who were both very knowledgeable on the history of the early Chinese in Southern California. Paul Spitzeri of the Homestead Museum, who is the expert on the legal system and also lynch law in Los Angeles during that time period. Hinda Rudd, who was the former archivist for the city of Los Angeles, and John Cahoon at the Seaver Center, who pointed me toward a lot of good photos and documents. And finally, many, many staff members of both the Downtown Public Library and the Huntington Library in Pasadena. Those are the two places where I did most of my research. And finally, I want to acknowledge Paul DeFala, who did the pioneering research on the Chinese Massacre of 1871, which he published in 1960. And even though I didn't get to meet him personally, his work has served as a roadmap for those of us who came afterward. During the talk today, Isis will be showing some historical photos. And if you have questions or comments that are better addressed during my talk instead of afterward, I ask her to please interrupt me and we'll deal with those as they arise. I'm going to apologize in advance because I finished my research in 2010, 12 years ago, and so a lot of the facts and details are not as fresh in my memory as I would like, but I will do the best I can to deal with any questions. So this afternoon, I'm going to touch briefly on three topics. The first is the social and racial climate of Los Angeles in the years preceding the Chinese Massacre. Second, I'm going to give an overview of what happened on the evening of October 24th, 1871. Finally, I'm going to summarize the court proceedings and certain other developments that came out of the massacre. Los Angeles in 1870 was a Wild West town of only 5,700 people. Most Americans outside of California had never heard of it. Californians knew about Los Angeles mainly because of its reputation for violence. It was called the toughest town in the entire nation, a place that attracted rootless drifters and hot-headed young thugs. This was an era of sheer recklessness and disregard for human life. Minor disputes were often settled with guns and knives. Now, this recklessness wasn't limited to any one segment of the population. It pervaded every level of society. Even some of the town's most prominent residents were quick to draw weapons and challenge each other to duels. Los Angeles had the state's highest per capita murder rate in the 1850s and 1860s. These frequent killings prompted some people to take the law into their own hands. As a result, Los Angeles also had the highest number of lynchings in California. These so-called vigilance committees hanged nearly 50 suspects in the 2 decades before the Chinese Massacre. The town's first Chinese residents settled in the roughest neighborhood of an unusually rough town. The rents there were cheap, and the Chinese workers were trying to save money to send home. Calle de los Negros, the short street that ran through the Chinese Quarter, was known as the 5 Points or Barbary Coast of Los Angeles. Its saloons and brothels drew hoodlums and toughs who were spoiling for a fight. Many Angelenos were afraid to walk through that neighborhood, even in the daytime. Calle de los Negros was located between the old plaza and what was then the town's principal business district. Even though Los Angeles was home to fewer than 200 Chinese in 1870, they were highly visible to the larger population because of the downtown location of the Chinese Quarter. At first, non-Asian residents took a live and let live attitude toward the Chinese among them. In fact, the press coverage of the early events in the Chinese community ranged from neutral to somewhat positive. Affluent Angelenos sought to hire Chinese men to work in their houses, vineyards, and orchards. They also bought vegetables from Chinese peddlers, took their clothes to Chinese laundries, and consulted Chinese physicians, such as Dr. Jean Tong. Things started to change noticeably in 1869, when a Los Angeles daily newspaper launched a series of vitriolic editorials denigrating Chinese immigrants as animals who lived in dens, filthy and disgusting, an inferior and idolatrous race, and a foul blot upon our civilization. This hate mongering was the work of white labor proponents who wanted to expel Chinese immigrants from the country. Around the same time, violent and unprovoked attacks on the Chinese residents of Los Angeles started to rise sharply. Meanwhile, far too many non-Asian Angelenos reacted to these anti-Chinese incidents with apathy and even laughed them off. Most influential citizens remained silent, choosing not to speak out against the hateful, racist attacks, both in the press and on the streets. In doing so, they helped foster an atmosphere of indifference in which the mob of October 24th would later carry out its crimes. While I've painted a rather dire picture of Los Angeles in the years before the massacre, some positive developments were also happening. The Chinese, more than any other recent immigrants to the area, learned to use the American legal system to redress wrongs committed against them. They brought small claims seeking unpaid wages, unpaid laundry bills, and overcharges by landlords. A blatantly racist California statute prohibited Chinese from testifying against whites, but that didn't stop them from going to court if they could prove their cases using other evidence. Even though some of the people the Chinese sued were prominent citizens of Los Angeles, the Chinese plaintiffs won a large majority of these lawsuits. The Chinese community of Los Angeles was small in 1870, but its small size didn't mean that its people were united. Regional differences that divided people in the homeland resurfaced in California. These disputes were also rooted in commerce and personal animosity. Business was highly competitive in the Chinese Quarter. The Chinese merchants had not succeeded in attracting a very large non-Asian clientele, so they tried all sorts of tactics to gain more patronage from their own countrymen. By 1870, the neighborhood was witnessing an all-out power struggle as the leaders of two Chinese factions competed for dominance. In March 1871, 7 months before the massacre, members of one faction abducted the beautiful young wife of a prosperous merchant and forced her to marry one of their own men. This scandal caused a huge uproar in the Chinese community, and tensions continued to simmer throughout the summer of 1871. I'd like to point out here that some accounts of the Chinese massacre make it sound as if the tension between these two factions developed over the course of 3 or 4 days. Actually, it had been brewing for more than a year. And even though the abduction of the young wife was the worst incident, there were several other incidents of retaliation by one faction against the other that had stoked the fires. So by October 1871, the leaders of the other faction decided it was time to settle the score. They recruited some professional Chinese gunmen from San Francisco. Shortly before sundown, on October 24th, a gunfight broke out between several members of the two Chinese factions. Local lawmen and curiosity seekers rushed to the neighborhood to see what was going on. In the confusion, they started firing haphazardly at the Chinese buildings. Some Chinese returned the gunfire from inside. A white resident approached the open doorway of the Wing Chun store, even though police officers warned him to get back. He stood in the door and fired 2 random shots into the dark room for no apparent reason. That seemed like a suicidal act in the heat of a gun battle, but this type of reckless behavior was common in Los Angeles at that time. The white man was hit by return fire and died shortly afterward. I'd like to point out another misconception. Several accounts of the Chinese massacre say that this white man was accidentally caught in the crossfire between the two Chinese factions, as if he just happened to step out in the street right in the middle of a gun battle. That is not the case. He actually provoked the incident by firing 2 unnecessary shots into the Coronel Adobe. And that was confirmed by the testimony of the 2 police officers who were with him on the veranda at that time. Within an hour, hysterical rumors had circulated throughout Los Angeles that the Chinese were killing the white men by wholesale. As darkness fell, an angry mob of Anglo and Latino men started to grow in the Chinese Quarter. The crowd was roughly estimated at 500, about 1/10 of the town's population, but no one really knows how big it was. What's more significant is that this mob had the Chinese buildings completely surrounded. Now, at this juncture, the sheriff might have used his limited forces to break up the crowd and close off the area before things turned ominous. Instead, he was so intent on arresting the Chinese gunman that he told the crowd not to let anyone escape from the buildings. Both he and the city marshal actually told bystanders to shoot any Chinese who tried to flee. With these orders, they sealed the fate of the innocent Chinese trapped inside their homes and shops. By 8:45, after a 3-hour standoff, the police were no longer able to hold back the large, unruly crowd. The mob's leaders battered their way into the Coronel Adobe, the main building that the Chinese leased. The rooms in the old adobe house were connected by interior doors, so it was easy for the mob to gain access to the entire premises. The scene that followed inside the Coronel Adobe was horrifying and chaotic. Bloodthirsty men poured through the building. They threatened police officers and any citizens who tried to stop them. They kicked, beat, shot, and stabbed the Chinese occupants, and they plundered and destroyed their property. They put ropes around several men's necks and started dragging them through the streets to 3 different lynching sites downtown. The ringleaders were jovial as they carried out their grisly work. They actually seemed to enjoy it. At Tomlinson's Corral, the mob members amused themselves by pulling on a hanging rope so that one victim's head smashed against a crossbeam repeatedly. The rioters thought they could get away with it because they were so many. They also knew that their fellow Angelenos didn't seem to care much about what happened to the Chinese. In little more than half an hour, the mob brutally tortured and murdered 18 Chinese. 15 died by hanging, and another 3 were shot. One victim was the town's most popular Chinese physician, a married man in his early 30s who used the name Jean Tong. Another was a 15-year-old boy. There's no record of how many other Chinese were badly wounded during the riot. Some victims were captured in the streets. They were just returning home from work and didn't even know that a gun battle had taken place earlier that evening. A few non-Asians tried to stop the mob, and several potential Chinese victims were rescued and taken to safe locations. Otherwise, the massacre toll could have easily climbed much higher. Of the 18 who died at the hands of the mob, only 1 was believed to have taken part in the gunfight that preceded the massacre. The other 17 were trapped in the wrong place at the wrong time. The killing spree of October 24th was the bloodiest attack on Chinese immigrants the nation had experienced at that time. The Chinese Massacre was also the first event to draw nationwide attention to Los Angeles. It was a public relations disaster for the city, whose civic boosters were careful to downplay the massacre in the years to come. Nonetheless, the city's leaders knew that there had to be a reckoning because the eyes of the nation were on them. The Los Angeles grand jury returned indictments against 37 of the mob members. 25 were indicted for murder and the other 12 for lesser crimes. 10 men were brought to trial. No one knew how these trials would turn out. It was hard for the prosecutor to get eyewitnesses to testify because they were afraid of retaliation by the mob members and their friends. It was also a challenge to find unbiased jurors. Still, 8 of the 10 defendants were convicted. Their sentences ranged from 2 to 6 years. 7 of them were sent to San Quentin immediately, while the 8th was released pending his appeal. These sentences were so light because the 8 ringleaders ended up being convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. Now, manslaughter seems like a woefully inadequate way to characterize the vicious murders that occurred on October 24th. What happened in the first trial was that 11 of the jurors voted for a murder conviction, but 1 juror held out. The other 11 decided to compromise on a manslaughter verdict. If they hadn't compromised and the case had resulted in a mistrial, it's possible, perhaps even likely, that none of the rioters would have ever been held accountable. The following year, the California Supreme Court overturned the 8 convictions on a technicality. Now, after studying this case very carefully, it's hard for me to see this reversal as anything but a gross miscarriage of justice. Nonetheless, the Los Angeles judiciary was not to blame for this appalling outcome. In fact, the town's judges, lawyers, and juries had done their jobs surprisingly well under difficult circumstances. There would be no more lynchings in the city of Los Angeles after October 24th, as mob rule finally gave way to the rule of law. A couple of other interesting developments came out of the riot trials. In the prosecution of two of the Chinese gunmen, Chinese testimony was allowed for the first time in Los Angeles's district court. Later, some Chinese store owners sued the city for failing to prevent the destruction of their property during the riot. A lawyer for the city objected to the testimony of one of the firm's partners on the ground that Chinese were not allowed to testify against whites. The judge very sensibly concluded that the racially diverse city of Los Angeles was not a white person. The same judge also ruled that anti-Chinese sentiment was a relevant factor in selecting the jurors who would decide the fate of the mob members. Through all these developments, the local judiciary reminded non-Asian Angelenos that the Chinese immigrants among them were fellow human beings. This afternoon, I'd like to remember some of those fellow human beings by reading one of the last paragraphs of my book. Only bits and pieces of their stories remain, but that is enough. Jean Tong and his wife doted on their poodle. Tong Wan was a musician, popular at socials. Ah Wan sported a flashy diamond ring he had purchased with his savings. Hua Sin Kwai had lived on Calle de los Negros for 5 years. He must have known the inside story about everything that happened there. Ah Long and Ah Cut provided small pleasures, cigars and liquor, to those toiling in a harsh environment. Wing Chi had cooked a sumptuous feast that afternoon with an abundance of Chinese delicacies for his company's headman. He would not live to receive their compliments. Teenager Ah Lu had just arrived from China, eager to scale the heights of Gold Mountain. So many American dreams died on the gallows that night. If there are lessons to be learned from the Chinese massacre, the most obvious one is the danger of remaining silent while hate speech and hate crimes go unchecked. A second lesson, perhaps not as obvious, is that even an atrocity as horrible as the Chinese massacre doesn't automatically bring about a change in people's attitudes. In the decade that followed the massacre, prominent Angelenos continued to remain silent and allowed anti-Chinese sentiment to grow, culminating in the Exclusion Act of 1882. This sad development serves as a reminder that creating a climate of racial tolerance and respect for human rights requires the diligent effort and active participation of many people. It's not something that just happens on its own. I think I'll stop there and turn it back over to Isis to see if she's received any comments or questions or discussion.
Yeah, so my first one is from Jennifer. She says, sorry if this is outside of your expertise. Is there a connection between the Legend of Zorro and the history of vigilante justice in Los Angeles?
Jennifer, I wish I knew, because that's a great question. I think the person who might know would be Paul Spitzeri at the Homestead Museum. So perhaps contact him for that.
All right, and then Edgar asks, why is the street called Negro or Street of the Blacks?
It was named for some of the early Californians who had dark complexions, and the name from the beginning was considered insulting. But it stuck for a while until eventually it was widened and incorporated into Los Angeles Street in the late 1800s.
All right. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to start. Oh, here we go. Are there photos of the police officers? One of the wounded was identified as Officer, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Bilderrains?
I never have found a photo of the two officers, Bilderain and Sanchez, who were with the white man, Robert Thompson, who was shot. You know, there are photos of some of the other officers who were on the scene that night, but in all the archives I looked at, I never could find their photos. And, you know, keep in mind, this took place in 1871, which means, of course, there's no photo of Dr. Jing Tong, because that was still several years before most people went to photographers for portrait photos.
And Robert just wants to add to Jennifer's question. He says that he believes the Legend of Zorro was based on Tiburcio Vasquez.
That's a great question. That may be my next article.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, and then let's see. Alan says, what is surprising is that many stayed after this occurred. Did the population grow after this mass killing?
The population really started to grow, I believe, in the 1880s was the first real estate boom in the Los Angeles area. Offhand, it's been too long. I can't remember what the population was in the 1880 census for the city, but you know, the boom didn't really start till several years later.
And Alan, if you want to clarify, did you mean the population of Los Angeles or the population of Chinatown when you're asking that question? And I'm happy to re-ask it if you want to clarify. But Edgar asks, was Officer Bilderain nephew or brother wounded?
I am not sure. There was a young man who was shot and wounded in the knee, and I cannot remember if that was Bilderain's nephew. I don't think it was his brother. They had different last names. I'm sorry about that. I just don't remember the relationship there.
All right, and Alan clarifies that he's specifically talking about the Chinese population, if whether or not that continued to grow.
No, up until the Exclusion Act, the Chinese population of Los Angeles did continue to grow despite the massacre. It took some time for the early Chinatown, the area along Calle de los Negros, to be reoccupied, but actually, even though that was considered the Chinese quarter, according to the 1870 census, fewer than half the Chinese actually lived in that neighborhood. Some lived on the farms or orchards where they worked. Those who worked in households oftentimes lived in their employer's house. And there are also, I found several instances where 3 or 4 Chinese workers apparently rented a house somewhere else. So they were not all concentrated in one area.
All right, and then I have 2 people asking if we know where the victims are buried.
The victims were all interred in what was called the city cemetery, which no longer exists. If you know where the downtown, the Cortinas High School for Performing Arts, that sits on a portion of the old city cemetery, and the rest of the cemetery was destroyed by the construction of the Hollywood Freeway in 1949. So the graves were moved. The Chinese custom at that time was when someone died in the United States, to inter the body for about 7 years and then disinter the body and ship the remains back to the families in China to be buried in the homeland. And that is what happened with the massacre victims. According to an interview, I believe it was 1894, with some of the leaders of the Yuan or Chinese companies. By that year, they had completed the process of disinterring all the Chinese remains from the city cemetery and sending them home. And then the cemetery, even long before the freeway, the cemetery was completely disrupted, and Horace Bell complained that it was cut up and sold off to developers as home building sites.
All right. And Norma asks, were members of the mob mostly white or non-white? Brown.
They were, from what I could tell, and this is based only on the names of the people who were identified as having participated, it appears that Anglo and Latino men were represented in the mob in approximately the same proportion as their representation in the city's total population at that time. Now, as far as I could tell, all of the mob members who gathered at the Coronel Adobe were male. There is a report that as the victims were dragged through the streets, at least one woman and sadly a 10-year-old child was yelling out encouragement to the mob members. But I didn't find any evidence that any African Americans or Native Americans took part. It was an Anglo and Latino mob.
All right. And then Clara says, sorry, this was asked already. What are the ways the city of Los Angeles are apologizing for this or memorializing the history?
I'm sure many of you have been keeping up with the developments of the memorial, which is in the planning stages right now. I was reading an article a few days ago. They are doing a competition for the design of the Chinese Massacre Memorial. And I believe if they kept the deadline, I think the deadline closed last week. So the designs have been submitted. The working committee will reach a final decision on both the design and the location. My understanding is that the currently favored site is the park there at the plaza across North Los Angeles Street from the Chinese American Museum. And they may also mark the sites in the downtown area where the lynchings occurred and certain other events occurred. Unfortunately, most of those sites are today fairly nondescript, and so also very busy and not a good place for reflection. So they weren't really appropriate for a monument. Two of them are now occupied by the Los Angeles Mall downtown, and a third is located, Tomlinson's Corral, where Dr. Tong was hanged. It was located between the Federal District Courthouse and the Hall of Justice downtown.
All right. Edgar asks, is there any evidence that police officers were connected to wealthy Chinese for protection?
There has been, speculation over the years. It appears that the leaders of the Chinese companies, as well as some of the more prosperous merchants, did give gifts to police officers, which were suspicious and does raise questions about that. But I did not find any evidence that on the night of the massacre, the police officers were working for one faction or the other. I think even though they knew there were gunmen in town and they were expecting trouble, I don't think any of them anticipated an event like this. And I think they were caught essentially unawares, and there were too few of them to stop the mob.
All right. And then Kat asks, have you ever come across any firsthand accounts from the Chinese survivors?
No, I wish we could find that. Not only are there no known accounts from the survivors of the massacre, but there are so few documents that remain today that were created by Chinese living in California at that time. Now, certainly a lot of the people must have written letters back home, but all the archives I visited throughout the state, there's so little other than a few Chinese language newspapers, which give mostly commercial information and not much more.
All right, that's all the questions I have queued so far. Oh, wait, no, here we go. Claire asks, why do you think it's important for the history to be known?
Well, the old cliche, history can repeat itself. And, we certainly, I think, all have to be vigilant about the fact that these things not only can happen, they have happened. And, I think history can teach us some of the warning signs to look for in our times.
Here we go. Here's another one. Edgar says, I am a descendant of Officer Bilderin. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong then, Edgar. I am so sorry. Thank you for the presentation. As we finish up any last comments or questions you have, I just want to go through some upcoming programs we have at the Homestead Museum. We have behind the scenes tours coming back in November. So if you want to see our basements, our attics, things you don't get to see normally on our tours, that's the time to come see us. We have our ongoing nonfiction book club. If you want to join us, that's now happening in person. In December, we're happy to finally come back and do some events on site and outside and see the houses. So we have our Homestead our Homestead Holiday Open House. And I've got some more questions. Okay, let's see. Alan says, in Texas folklore of the Texas Rangers, one riot, one ranger is all that is needed. Those officers could have done more to turn this when it first started. Sorry, that was a comment, not a question. My bad.
Right. I did not mean to suggest in one of my last comments that it was unstoppable. One of the things I pointed out, during my talk is that I think at an early point in the evening, the officers could have done much more to break up the growing mob and try to close off the area to keep more people from pouring in. Again, I think both the sheriff and the city marshal, from their own comments, were so focused on arresting the Chinese gunmen that they let things get out of control. And by 3 hours later, at that point, I don't think there was too much they could have done to stop it.
All right, we just have some. Oh, sorry, continue.
Oh, I was just, to bring up the obvious, when I see the videos of what happened at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, I'm always reminded of the Chinese Massacre, the officers who tried to stop it and were overrun. And, if you've seen the video clips and you just imagine those intensified about 10 times, that was what was happening in the Coronel Adobe.
All right, and then just comments. Joyce says, it seems that there were more prejudiced people other than whites in that day. Claire says, thank you, Homestead Museum and the speaker for hosting this. I visited the Homestead as part of a school tour almost 40 years ago. All right, I think that's all I have. Thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you, Scott, so much for joining us today. And we hope you all have a lovely day, and thanks again.